Right. Hey everyone, I'm Jo Holden. I'm an active conduit for source intelligence and I'm here to help the collective. Okay, so this is one of those sessions where I started off with like one side of A4 notes that I thought this is not going to be a long session. This will not take me too long at all to put together. And as I've been putting it together in terms of the presentation for it, it's sort of grown and expanded. So rather than try and fit it all into one session, I've put the whole presentation together, but I'm going to split the recording of it into 3 parts. So part 1 is going to cover existing traditions and systems, and the mini series, if you like, is magic overview for lightworkers. So in this session, existing traditions and systems is what we'll cover. In the next one, it'll be the approaches, methods, tools and techniques. And then in the third session, it'll be the targeting and why anyone who identifies with any of the terms, any of the labels, any of the titles that you would associate with lightworking, you know, angel, volunteer soul, hybrid, starseed, all of that sort of stuff. Why it's particularly important that we are aware of what's out there and what's happening. Okay, so starting with the many traditions and systems. One of the first things I do want to emphasize is that there is, of course, a spectrum, and I'm sure there are many practitioners out there who only ever utilize their capabilities, their training, whatever form that's taken, their tools and techniques for good, on the light side, to be helpful, healing. I have been on the receiving end of the darker side of it, so what I'm going to be laying out is going to focus more heavily on that in terms of what we need to be aware of and, you know, how some of that stuff works. But that doesn't mean that I think it's all bad. You know, it doesn't mean that I'm sat in judgment of the entire art or science of magic or witchcraft or illusionism, or, you know, all of the various forms of it, which we, as we go through this, you know, we'll lay more of them out. So the grey area in between is that there are some practitioners I've seen as I've looked at various testimonials and podcasts and interviews, and there are some who would argue that baneful magic has its place in terms of balancing the scale where wrongs and harms have been caused, and people seek to, you know, rebalance the scales. I personally feel it's better to let go and let God, and, you know, trust that there's support and guidance that will ensure that what has been done wrong will be put right without needing to take those matters into our own hands. But, you know, we're in a world that is going through a major transition, and so I can understand at times in the past it may have felt that there was more of a need to fight fire with fire, you know, for lack of a better expression. So each to their own in terms of, you know, we're all entitled to draw our own conclusions and have our own thoughts and feelings about things. I personally, despite having now done a whole lot of research and despite having just cause, some people could say, to want to fight fire with fire, it doesn't appeal to me. On, you know, and my guidance is it's not worth the potential repercussions to get involved in utilizing this stuff, but to be aware of it is another thing entirely, and that is important. So that's why I'm sharing this information. I'm certainly not trying to steer anybody or encourage anybody to want to practically get involved, but I definitely do want people to be awake and aware to what these things are all about. So they do, as we go through this, all traditions and systems do tie in different ways to different religious and cultural influences. They are from across the world and have existed throughout the ages, and I really want to emphasize that, because at this point in time, I think what does tend to get a lot of focus is your voodoo and your hoodoo and your Santeria, which historically, culturally, they're kind of tied more to African traditions and belief systems that have become intertwined with various religious, Christian, Catholic, sort of religious systems, but they're certainly not the sum total of all of the traditions and systems that are out there. So what I wanted to do first was just do a very quick run through of a bit more of a historical perspective. I'm not going to go into a whole, lecture about it, because there is another session I want to do where I want to talk a little bit more about the history of more socially, politically, legally, like the background of how magic has been viewed and treated, and where we're at today. But just to give more of a general idea that, this is certainly not something that's tied to any specific area of the world or culture. It is from all over the place. So what I have done is put together some graphics and just some general searches for each of these areas, and there's a few of these slides just to give you more of an overview. So these images I've put there, shout out for images. There's a reader on YouTube called Chiron Intuition. You should look his channel up. He's great. If you're interested in tarot, of course. He's a fantastic reader, very knowledgeable, and he does share a lot of content in his community sort of page that is to help people understand more about the background, because in some of his readings, as he's laying out, what he's seeing in terms of the story of the cards in each particular reading that he does, he'll reference to certain like pantheons of gods and that kind of stuff. And he clearly does come from a background where he learned a lot about this kind of stuff, and was sort of immersed in it rather than from a amateur or beginner's perspective, having to try and get a grip of it. He speaks very wisely about this stuff. So he had, maybe a year ago, maybe even longer than that, he had been sharing these graphics to give people more of a background, more of a grounding in what some of his references were in some of his readings. And I have borrowed theirs, or took a record of them, because I found it fascinating, because I didn't have much knowledge about any of this stuff. So that's the shout out, and please, if you're interested in listening to tarot, look him up on YouTube. Is great. Okay, so going back further in time, Aztec gods, witchcraft and sorcery in ancient Mexico. Now, coming up in some of the sections, there's going to be more references to like South America, the various countries, and Mexico there's some fascinating podcasts that I've listened to where people, in modern times have talked about seeing very interesting things there, you know, giants and all types of sorcery and whatnot. So it's not that, you know, this stuff only existed back in the days of the Aztecs, but as we move forward, you'll see, you know, the whole point of this is to show this is not something new, and it's also not something contained to any particular area of the world. It's worldwide, and it goes back as long as we've got, you know, sort of records for things. So Persian gods. I'm not going to read all of these out. The whole point of this is not to give people a full, you know, lecture and explanation of who and what these gods are. You can, of course, if you want to pause and zoom in and have a look, if any of this is of significance to you, if you've got any major intrigue or interest in any particular tradition that I show you, then yeah, I'd encourage you to follow that instinct. But this is not supposed to be, quote unquote, schooling people on all of this in a very detailed way. It's an overview, right? So Persian gods, as you can see, fair few of them. Persian rituals and spells to exercise those possessed with dark forces. They talk about talismans and, you know, the various uses of magic, which we will be looking at in part 2 in more detail. So it states here that the Persians were considered inventors of magic. I guess that would trace all the way back to, you know, King Solomon, and we'll look at Solomonic magic coming up. But also, you know, never occurred to me to think of the more remote sort of native peoples such as your Inuits or Eskimos, and it had never occurred to me that there'd be a whole different set of gods that they would have. But when I saw that Chiron had included, you know, what I'm going to show you is not the full exhaustive list of all of the graphics that he shared, and, you know, he did give more details on his community tab of his channel about these things. But some of them really surprised me because, you know, again, being somewhat ignorant to any and all of this for quite some time, I was just, you know, blown away how much information there is, and how, you know, I've said this a few times at this point, but how prevalent it is and always has been, and just how pervasive throughout human history as a whole, you know, just how much a part of our reality it's been, given that we're currently living in an age where we've come through a few generations or several generations of being conditioned out of the belief in it, you know. So it felt for me like a very very significant mind shift, going from, oh, when people talk about magic and witchcraft, they're talking about something primitive and, you know, it's unsophisticated, it's just a more superstitious way of thinking about things. They just didn't understand science, you know, that was more kind of where my thoughts were at. And then being on the receiving end of some of the stuff that I described in the last couple of sessions that I did, you can imagine I was just kind of like, oh, wow, this stuff's like actually very real. So needless to say, that's why I started doing homework. So Inuit Eskimo gods, again, you know, if you want to zoom in and have a nosy at the names of them, and obviously you can look up and see what each represents. But the Tupilak, I think I'm saying that right, could be saying it wrong there, is a powerful form of Inuit magic that involves the creation of supernatural creature from a variety of materials. We'll talk a little bit more about how different traditions all seem to have within their systems this ability to not only conjure in terms of bring non-physical beings and entities into servitude, let's say, or into contract, into co-working, but there's also ways and means that if we relate the use of magic back to reality operating as a very, very, very sophisticated simulation, and we understand that the basis of reality is what we perceive from non-physical through to physical being light, which then creates a whole range of effects and configurations that brings everything that we interact with into form. Then underlying that is that, as we know, light is data in motion, data in transit. It's source coding powered by source will or God will. So that being the case, you can manipulate and mutate and change both positively and or negatively in terms of what your intention is, what the aims are of the practices that you're using. But you can either, amplify or diminish any and all types of effects that we see in the physical material reality around us. So when we get to like the types of practitioners and whatnot, some specialize far more in, for instance, there's mancers that will have areas of expertise. So you might have like a pyromancer, which would be fire, working with use of fire to create effects. You could have, most people would know necromancer, which is, I thought it was just sort of graveyard magic type stuff, but it turns out when you look at it, that's not true. It's more about working with the death current. So, the life current, if you like, is the source code, and it's a soul transmission. It's what gives life to. The death current would be what takes life from. It's when I talked about the I am and the I am not, everything does have a cycle. So there are currents for both giving to and amplifying and growing and developing and evolving and all of the positive. The positive is to give power to posit is to give to. So there's that current, which is God source creator's original organic current, and then the death current would be from an organic perspective, as life cycles of any and all living organisms or life forms come to a close. There would be a taking power from, a winding down, removing the source will, the God's will, and the organic coding so that it can sort of disintegrate and re-immerse back into the energetic soup, if you like, of reality, and then it will be reutilized to reform and represent as something else. But you can have practitioners who that is their area of expertise, is sort of manipulating and working with that. And if that's used negatively, it ties in with your death magic and all that kind of stuff. So there's many different ways and means that any and all of these traditions use different sort of techniques to create from what is organically available in terms of energy, in terms of data, in terms of potential and possibility. And I hadn't realised until I was doing this research just how much of that can involve the creation of entities. So, we'll look at that in part 2, but there's, servitors and egregores and tulpas and golems and all sorts of entities that, you know, the practitioners themselves can kind of conjure and create through their will and through their intention, which is, I found it pretty fascinating. So let's move on to the next slide. So we've got Chinese gods, again, whole pantheon of them. I'm realizing I could do with this page being a little bit bigger because I'm struggling to see properly. Just bear with me. All right, so as we know, Eastern sort of history and traditions go all the way back to ancient times when the Western world, in many ways, when you start looking at the history, seems to have a lot more records of this kind of stuff more in like modern day, whereas in the East there does seem to be a whole lot more information of this being something that they've maintained knowledge and awareness and traditions in a much more let's say everyday kind of ways, and it's culturally written into many of the philosophies and the ethics and the storytelling, the cultural narratives, even in modern times. Whereas I feel like in the West we tend to have this view of it being something that was primitive and not real, and anything that we know people are practicing today, we see it one as kind of more symbolic or representative or quirky, or we don't really take it seriously, and we also seem to see it as something that's newly emerged, like some sort of almost like nostalgic kind of, like people just wanting to role play almost what the superstitious beliefs of the past were. I'm not sure if I've explained that very well, but that's the impression I get when I look at Western sort of articles and how it's portrayed in media and whatnot. It seems to come across as like a little bit like when people are like, oh, goths, or it's sort of like an identity that we give to people, but it's not seen as something that is then seen as an actual occupation or profession, or when I say it's not taken seriously, I don't mean that as in everyone's just like ha ha ha, we're laughing at these people. I don't mean it that way. I just mean it more in a, people are like, oh, okay, it's like a lifestyle choice. It's not an actual something that you do and take seriously because you're actually affecting the fabric of reality, if you know what I mean. So that's not the case as I've seen it, as I've been doing this research, when you look at other parts of the world, and certainly, the sort of more Eastern cultures seem to have a much greater respect and belief in the efficacy and the reality of this stuff. So okay, so as you can see in the Chinese sort of traditions, a lot of emphasis on psychic powers and working with different types of spirits, and it made me think as well of like your kung fu films and stuff, even though you can argue, well, there's nothing supernatural, they're just incredibly talented in terms of their ability to defy laws of gravity and whatnot in terms of some of the things that they're able to do in those films. But I'm no expert. I'm pretty sure I can remember seeing different kung fu style films that do integrate, like use of magic with the martial arts, and stuff. So I'm sure there's people out there that know a whole lot more about that than me. And then, of course, I've circled there's Chinese shamanism, which is one of the forms of magic that we'll look at. Also Celtic gods, again, whole plethora. We will look a little bit more at sort of the pagan traditions. Looking at the information available, it's been harder to find testimonies from witches or warlocks or druids or alchemists or any of the practitioners. It's been harder to find examples of them speaking more specifically about spell work that they've done and the outcome of it, and a very real sort of raw account of things. What I've tended to find with these traditions is that they're either those practitioners who are very like love and light, and they're just, it's more about a community for them, and it is about caring for the planet, and it's about caring for others, and it's, which there's nothing wrong with any of that. That's, I feel a resonance with that myself. But they don't really talk all that much about what it practically or functionally is that they practice. And I'm sure, there are many books and stuff that if you want to learn it, you can. But I was looking for materials where I could find practitioners that in some sort of concise way summed up the types of things that they would typically seek to accomplish with their art, with their practice, to share with people. And I struggled to do that with that particular tradition. And maybe that's because it is just so widely spread and used in such different ways. I get the impression it's very eclectic. So if that's the case, then maybe I've just not dropped on the right, interview or podcast yet. But there's certainly in Western cultures a lot of evidence to suggest that paganism and what's sort of, they're not synonymous, but they are attached to, you've got like Wicca and Druidism, and I believe such as your Romani type traditions, they're all tied to paganism, which paganism itself is it's more like the religion, it's more the belief system, and then the forms of witchcraft kind of branch off from that. So maybe because it's so varied, that's why it's difficult to get a real handle on, so what would the core focus of your practice be? But it does also seem to be very widespread. So, like nowadays it's much more popular. You can go into your various sort of crystal shops and new agey type. A lot of that stuff seems to be where it all ties in with the sort of pagan traditions and the various forms of witchcraft. So that's a little bit more about that. Indian and Hindu gods, again, of course I were aware of some of these. I think, Hinduism has gotten, there's more awareness in, I'm from the UK, so in my culture I've got some awareness of some of these gods, but not, I've never known a great deal. It's not something I've gone into a lot of sort of detailed research around, but it does seem that because of the various migrations throughout the years, and some forced, some chosen, I guess you would say, but because of like there being empires and because of there being trades, some abhorrent ones such as the slave trade, and because of those migrations, because of those movements, the mix of different cultural traditions coming together, Britain obviously part of their empire, when based in India, there was definitely some of what was seen through their folk practices, let's say, became almost a form of entertainment over in Britain. So they would bring back practitioners who were able to, like the snake pits thing, where there'd be practitioners that they could get bit but the venom wouldn't kill them, and like snake and enchanters and that kind of stuff. During those times were things like that it wasn't necessarily just about practicing magic in a behind the scenes casting spells on people kind of thing. There was also what went on to become like stage magic, so there was that kind of crossover as well that happened as a result of the difference in cultures, because for the average sort of British person at that time, culturally speaking, that was something mind-blowing. No one had seen those types of tricks or fates be practiced commonly. So right, next one. So Native American gods, again, whole pantheon. Here it talks about the different types of magic that they can and have and do use. I do know the Native American traditions did become more tied in with some of what are now the more popular systems that practitioners will use. I know that Native American customs, traditions, certainly their shamanism, their use of different like natural materials and herbs, and their vision questing and all of that kind of stuff definitely has been drawn upon, even inclusive into a lot of the sort of mind control research that was done. There's a connection there in terms of what was borrowed and or stolen in terms of knowledge and practice. So that gives some description of the types of spell work and or psionic work typically used. Slavic Russian gods, again, it never occurred to me that there'd be a whole other pantheon, because when I think of pantheons of gods, I think of like ancient Greece, I think of Roman, but that's just because that reflects the extent of my education, I guess, when it comes to what my cultural norms were, what people would typically speak about. I had no idea that there was such rich and varied accounts and belief systems out there. So as you can see, again, I'm not going to read it all out, but just circled there. If I remember correctly from this particular article that came up, it's talking more about how in Russia, historically speaking, the use of witchcraft, it was more men that would be using it, because we often think of witchcraft as being a predominantly female pursuit or practice. This article that I've circled is talking about, it were more, I guess, what you would call your wizards and your warlocks that were more in the know, that had more training, more experience in use of magic. Hawaii gods, again, it's just the variety. I've tried to select comparing and contrasting different areas of the world that have very different customs. So use of divination, which throughout all types of magic, you see that need to be connected to quote unquote spirit, which, connection to the system, to the organic system and the inorganic aspects of the operating system of reality is essential to be good at what you do if you're a practitioner in these disciplines. African gods, so you will and do see in a lot of the more popular uses of magic these days, the African gods do tend to be highlighted and be more prominent, let's say, but the whole point of this is to show you that there's certainly, every tradition and every approach has different gods and or saints or ascended masters or various figures and representatives of the powers that are bestowed within the practice of the system that's being used. So you've got African gods, you've got Aborigine gods, Mesopotamian gods. So again, just giving that more, goes all the way back in history, all the way up to present day. All right, so again, I've circled here, just really want to emphasize, as we go through the next few clips, it's not that I'm only highlighting the dark side of it because I want everyone to feel like, ooh, boo, bad. Because the whole point of this overview is to help light workers, volunteer souls, people who may never have had cause to look into any of this stuff, to bring to their awareness what is very real and possible and is happening. And when we get to part 3, I'll explain why those who are here to be of great assistance to the transition that's happening, they are prime targets for a lot of the more baneful stuff. So as we go through the next clips, I'm not trying to paint a negative light on the entire practice of magic, but there's going to be more emphasis on that side of it because this is supposed to be a session that assists with the awakening for people, that's going to be useful for their protection, for their growth, for their it's going to be helpful and assistive to them. So there's no point me just talking about all the nice things that magic can be used for. If they need to be aware, they need to be aware of what the risks are. Okay, so tradition systems, some of the names, titles, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but the ones I've most commonly come across has been voodoo, spelled either way, hoodoo, Santeria, Paolo. Within paganism, there is Wicca, there's Druidism. As I've said, I believe Romany comes under that same category. Solomonic and Thellamagic, which comes from Thelema or Thelema, which is Aleister Crowley. In one of the previous sessions, I highlighted his sort of connection to the Order of the Golden Dawn. That's going to come up a bit later in this, because that definitely does seem, certainly in our culture, to be when practitioners now who are very committed to what is classed as the left-hand path, their baneful magical techniques, let's say, do tend to come from the Thellamagic and Solomonic, but Solomonic actually is embedded heavily within Thellamagic, which Yeah, when we get to it, you'll see what I mean, because I've put some examples together.
I don't care who you were.
Okay, so there's some clips I want to play rather than me just talking at you and trying to best describe in my own words, given that I'm not a practitioner. I thought it would make a lot more sense to use clips from actual practitioners describing different uses of magic. I have tried to ensure that the clips that I've chosen not only talk about the dark aspects of it and the negative potentials, that the effects that can be had, but I really do want to emphasize as well that we can protect ourselves, and we do have, naturally, organically speaking, the more aligned with our organic soul transmission we are, the more on path we are in terms of showing up and doing what we're here to do. You know, if we're in purpose and we're helping and assisting others and the planet, and we bring in positivity to the world, that in and of itself also provides various types of protection for us. So there's definitely things that we have to utilize our own will to set boundaries and agree or disagree, you know, like, do you consent or do you not consent to certain things? So it's good to know the types of practices that are used, because you'll see as we go through these sessions, one of the traps is that these dark practices rely on technicalities and quote-unquote spiritual legalities that if we're not aware of, we don't even know to refute and rebut and reject and rebuke. You know, it's that sometimes our consent is gained against our will but without our awareness. So we do have protection. We also do need to know how and when we need to, like, exert our organic will to refute and refuse things, right? So as we go through, I just wanted to highlight that yes, some of these clips are pretty dark, but we do have power and we do have protection and we do have the right and the ability to block and stop any of this stuff from happening. So in various circumstances, even the darkest magic will fail. Okay, so let's just play this.
Okay, who you know? Don't care what you call yourself. If you were Catholic and you say you were Christian and you say you were a believer, I was going to kill you unless you had a real relationship with Jesus Christ. And the lady that lived downstairs, she came up and she told me, my husband is cheating. I want you to kill the woman he's cheating with. Put a witchcraft spell on her and kill her. How much you charge me? I said, well, come back. I'm going to speak to the devil, my daddy, and I'll let you know. Come back in a couple of days. So the lady came back. The devil told me what to buy. He said, buy a coffin box, buy 21 black candles, buy an image of the lady, put her in the box, you know, to do the witchcraft, to kill this lady. So we were going to do her for 21 days. She was going to die. After 21 days, we were going to do her funeral. So when the lady came to my house, I said, I'm going to charge you $10,000. I told her to kill the lady. She said, sure. She said, I tell you what, I know you. You've been good to me. I go to your house parties. Give me $7,000. I'll give you 30% off. I said, I'll kill her. Give me 30%. I take 30% off the 10. Give me $7,000. So when the lady was going to leave my house, she said, by the way, she's a Christian. She said, the lady's a Christian. I said, I'll kill her for free. I said, I don't need the money. I said, I'm going to kill her for free. I'm going to teach these Christians a lesson that they're going to learn. I'll kill her for free. I told her, I don't want your money. I'll kill her for free. So I did the voodoo thing. I did the witchcraft thing. And 21 days went by. The lady didn't die. A month went by. The lady didn't die. And I was like, wow, you know, what's going on? I mean, my reputation's online. So I called the devil. I called the demons. I was signed. I increased the witchcraft. I increased the witchcraft. I doubled the witchcraft on it so she can die like overnight. Nothing was going on. Nothing was going on. I was home at night and the devil shows up. And I feel the presence of the devil comes into my house. And then the devil told me, we have to abort the plan of the lady that you want to kill. And I said, why would we want to abort the plan? My reputation on the line. I'm a witch. I'm a warlock. If I don't kill the lady, they're going to think that I don't have any powers. The devil said, you don't understand. The God that she serves said, don't leave her alone. Don't touch her. And I said, who's this God? She said, the God that she serves. So I was so angry. I was so saying, no, but let's get one more week. Let's kill her. And he said, no, the God that she serves said, leave her alone. From the witchcraft that I did to the lady, she should have been dead in less than 21 days.
Okay, so he's talking about death magic, obviously. All sorts of techniques that can be used for that. It sounds, from what research I've done, that there can be quite an elaborate, ritual that has to take place, and it sounds like you have to be fairly practiced to know what you're doing, because you are entering into contracts with the devil and various other negative entities acting on behalf of, under instruction from the devil, from what I've heard these practitioners say. So John Ramirez, for anybody that's not familiar with him and his testimony, he was a pretty high-ranking warlock within his area. He's from New York, and the more you look into this stuff, the more you realize that it's such a hierarchy in terms of almost like a pyramid scheme. It's I don't think he operated like at the highest levels with the elites and that sort of stuff. We are going to hear some clips where some practitioners that did work at that level share some testimony, but he was within his area well known for being very effective at what he did. He did end up converting over to be a pastor or a preacher or some sort of official religious figure who has spent many years now speaking out, against these types of practices, having engaged in them himself. In fact, what he's talking about there, that was sort of part of his awakening, that whole being told by the devil, we're going to abort this plan, when he'd successfully used death magic so many other times. It raised question marks for him. The wording of that, the God that she serves, talking about this target, the efforts not being successful, he was like, but there's no one more powerful than the devil, is there? Or, what God is it that she serves then? Because if you hear his whole testimony, he talks about how and why he got drawn into that way of being and way of living, and how devoted he was to it, because he came, as you can imagine, from a pretty dark childhood, and his perception of reality had been heavily affected by that, to the point where he didn't really believe in a good God. He didn't really believe in a higher power or intelligence or source of love, or because he didn't feel that he'd ever experienced that. So he went the other way and decided, if it can bring me riches and respect and give me a sense of, that false sense of power, because essentially what we're taking from others, as in from the physical material reality, it's only ever going to be a pale representation or comparison to what power we can experience when we are more open and receptive to our organic soul transmission and expression. So, he now talks a lot more about learning that side of it when he went through his conversion. All right, so he mentioned voodoo. So I've put a whole bunch of information together about voodoo, hoodoo, Santeria, and Paolo. They are all different. They often kind of get clumped together, but they do have different backgrounds and different tools and techniques associated with them. They also, it appears that although each does seem to have a historical sort of origination from various African countries, how they developed over time and sort of spread in different areas of the world seems to be part of the differentiation. So Santeria, I believe, were more your South Americas, where they developed and evolved. I believe voodoo, in fact, I think it says here, yeah, so it was more when they came to like the North Americas, or North America rather, the different states. Hoodoo, I believe, is more like your Caribbean islands, where they evolved and took shape. Paola, the only practitioner I've heard talk more specifically about that is Julie Lopez, and her background, I believe it were more your Spanish-speaking countries, and perhaps not Spain itself, but in your South American countries, you know, like Costa Rica and those types of places, I believe it was practiced more so in those places. So again, I'm not going to read it all out to you because I think that'll just be boring. If you want to pause and zoom in and have a look, or obviously there's a lot of information online if you want to look at any of these things. So let's do another clip.
Potions were
just to explain, so Curtis Kelly, he's also talking about voodoo, but again, when you listen to these testimonies, there does definitely seem to be an overlap in, regardless of what label you give the tradition or the system, the various tools and techniques and aims and intentions, what, you know, the purpose of the spell work is, seems to be very shared across these various traditions. So it really does just seem to be how you've learned, with whom you've learned, from where you've learned, that will give it a different, you know, name or title.
How to use them, how to slow a person's business down, as far as if you wanted to work a person over real bad with Pavo Nocturnus. Pavo Nocturnus is a really bad thing. Night terror. She showed me how to put a person in Nemos. Nemos is to put a person in a vicious spiral that they can never get out of. And the more they pay you to cast a spell off of them, the more they get wrapped into the spell. It's called Nemo cycle. And she said, you keep a person in Nemo cycle, you'll never be broke, because I got to keep coming back to you to get another spell and another spell, get them off of that spell, another spell off of that spell. And she was really, really a wicked person, and she was into control, manipulation, and keeping the person bound and attached to her. And that's what she was teaching me. She taught me, so many things, but those were one of the main two things that she was teaching me. And she took advantage of them not having a whole lot of money and trying to get over real fast. And many of them, they were into the occult. They were not witches, but they believed that if God took too long, the occult would get it right now. They wanted that quick fix. And she was there to receive them. She's like a catcher's mitt, you know, there to catch you, you know. And at $20 back then was a lot of money, you know. $20 not like it is now. That's just a tip now. But $20 back then was a lot of money. And she would charge like $20 to say you had like I said, a condition, physical condition. What they would do with your physical condition, they didn't have the power to heal you. If you had a cramp right here, they would remove the cramp from here and they would put it down here in your knee. They would shift it. No, shifter. There's called witchcraft called shifting, where you can't heal, you don't have that power, but you shift. And they teach you she teaches me how to shift things from here to there. I move it over here. What you do, you get a whole lot of people together in one room, all miserable, all suffering. You charge them $20, and you don't give them all of it. You give them a piece of the information to keep them coming back. And as a child, I stood there and I watched, and I said, this lady sure can't control people. She has a very crafty way of controlling people. And many of the people that she was controlling, they went to church on a regular basis. She would say, isn't God good? Oh, don't we praise God today? And I would stand off in the corner watching it. Oh, isn't God good? But see, I can run up and down the stairs and see and bring her supply of witchcraft stuff. You know, bring me this, bring me that, and bring me my pouch of this, or bring me my this, bring me my oil, bring me this. And I would bring this to her, and the people would give her the money, and she would give them this pouch, and they would go home, and I'd watch husband after husband, boyfriend after boyfriend come back, because as usual, she was using.
One day, the voodoo priestess showed young Curtis a doll, which had some paranormal powers.
Remember back in those days where you pulled the string and the doll would talk? Well, she didn't have to pull the string for her doll to talk. The doll would just talk to her, and she would talk back to the doll. And I was standing there in amazement. I said, how can a doll have how can you communicate with an object that's not even human? But what it was, through this doll, the entity was housed, and it could talk. Okay, it's a spirit that goes inside of an inanimate object and could actually communicate. It can spin his head around, it can flap his eyes, it can move his mouth. But when you go to approach it, it just sits there.
Right, so with that, there are a couple of things I wanted to emphasize about it. So where Curtis Kelly is talking about, a lot of the people that would go to this practitioner for help, they themselves came from a faith background. What you will hear a lot in a lot of these testimonies is conversion from, the quote unquote dark side, using these types of practices into more official covenants and commitments to various religious organizations. So there seems to be a lot of practitioners that, have experienced something dramatic or traumatic enough that they've realized that, they're in a descentive sort of cycle or spiral, and they want out of that kind of trap. And so what they found is whichever particular, religion has spoke to them, has appealed to them. But religion in and of itself, I think it's important to emphasize, it doesn't have to be an institution that quote unquote saves you. I'm not suggesting people shouldn't pursue that if they feel called to, but for me personally, I've never been a religious person. I wasn't raised that way. I weren't introduced really. I mean, in a very informal kind of way, or we'd go to churches for weddings and christenings, but we weren't regular attendees, let's say, at any kind of service. Or so I really want to make the point that your connection to God Source Creator is your organic soul transmission, because ultimately you are a representation of that intelligence, of that power source. And so should we find ourselves in a situation where, we're either the target of, or we've become embroiled in these types of dark practices, do I think it has to go through a religious route whereby, you formally saved? And no, because that hasn't been my experience, and I've certainly felt protected and supported. I believe everything that's happened was to raise my awareness so I can speak on it and share this information with people. But have I felt abandoned by whoever, whatever you imagine that higher source to be? No, I've felt, if anything, more connected and cocooned, although been a trying time in terms of learning about this stuff, because it's not what I thought my pathway forward were going to look like. I didn't think I was going to be needing to learn this stuff. But once I got over, the initial hurt and upset that I'd been targeted in this way, it's actually become quite interesting learning about this stuff. And I have certainly felt guided every step of the way. So, I really just wanted to emphasize, yes, you'll hear a lot of people talk about, it weren't until Jesus saved me or God stepped in, as if it's, there's a need for that institutional authority, because many of these practitioners will talk about it in relationship to a specific approach to religion. And from my point of view, it doesn't have to happen that way. And, we each and all should trust the process and follow whatever our guidance steers us towards. So, but with that, also, the doll thing, it's hard to imagine, right, that, like, what should be an inanimate object, but I have heard this a fair few times now in different testimonies from different either ex-practitioners, or there was a podcast that I listened to, and I'll have to find it out. I can't exactly remember who the guy was, but I'm pretty sure it were on the Joe Rogan Experience. I'll have to go back through my watch history and find which of his episodes I've watched. But the guy was talking about he and his profession had something to do with having to go, it was sort of like a pest control type thing, but having to go out, and if there were certain types of snakes, I believe it was, that it would get called out to go and catch them or kill them, or whatever the agreement was there. But he'd gone to this site that was sort of it was like a military installation, and he said it were out in the middle of nowhere, that it's not the type of place you'd go for any other reason than if you were working at that facility. But I think he talked about it as being more abandoned, like, it would, I don't think it were in use anymore. But someone had contacted him and contracted him and employed him to go, because apparently there'd been some sort of report of there being some kind of satanic practices being carried out there. And somehow, some way, this had led to there being these dangerous snakes around. So he'd gone, and I don't think he was alone. If I remember correctly, he'd gone with, he took, other team members, or there was other people with him. And when they got there, they did find a whole lot of paraphernalia, as if there'd been, some sort of sacrificing happening, and pentagrams on the ground and all this kind of stuff. And they were looking for these snakes to do their job. But he said during that experience, there'd been a doll that had run at either himself or one of the people that he was with. And, it's not what you think you're signing up for, is it? It must have been quite freaky. So yeah, I'm assuming that kind of stuff ties in with the whole invocation practice type thing, which we'll talk about in session 2, but kind of fascinating. All right, so pagan, as you can see, I've put some info together for as far as I'm aware, Wicca is in and of itself its own system. However, I think Wicca falls under paganism. So you can be pagan and not Wicca, but you can't be Wicca and not pagan, if that makes sense. So it's it kind of, I believe it's more the use of magic within the pagan traditions, and I believe Druidism is more, I think, more the male aspect of it, and I think that's more tied to like your alchemy and elemental works and like nature magic. Although there is some of that when you look at, you know, within Wicca as well, but I think Druidism is more about like working with planetary forces, whereas Wicca's more about like doing work for humans or against humans or with humans, you know, so it's more the human experience as opposed to the celestial sort of side of it. There's probably people out there that'll hear this and go, that's not the best distinction. Obviously it's something you can look into and look up, but that was my impression just looking through general information about it. As I told you, I really struggled to find succinct sort of testimonies that helped kind of narrow it down more to like, oh, if you think of paganism or you think of Wicca or you think of Druidism, it's more specifically this, you know. It was difficult to do that. It does seem very eclectic. So anybody that watches this, if I've not done a great job of explaining and describing that, please feel free to put some, you know, comments beneath so that people do get a better understanding of it. Okay, so here's a clip more connected to that. It doesn't, again, go into detail about what the practices are, but I did find it interesting that in Romania, the way it's understood and the way it's, you know, the sort of social and cultural narratives around it, you'll see in this clip it's very front and center, whereas, you know, it's more muted in other areas of the world. I think where I'm from in the UK, it's still something that most people sort of scoff at and dismiss. That's not the case in Romania, so let's play this.
Witchcraft is alive and thriving.
Magie din magie! E ca puterea magiei!
I am travelling to a small village on the outskirts of Romania's capital city, Bucharest, to find out just how real this ancient magic really is, inside the personal home of Europe's most powerful witches. After spending time in Roma gypsy communities across Europe, I was told of powerful Roma witches that had the power to heal, to hurt, to create and destroy love, and even to influence political decisions. In order to learn more about this culture of witchcraft, I not only have to befriend this family, but I have to become part of the ritual myself. What if their magic isn't just superstition? What if it works? Am I ready for the consequences of dealing in magic with the most powerful witches in Europe? Oh my God, that was intense.
Yeah, it was.
That was crazy.
So it doesn't state exactly what that was, but if you know, by the way, above each of these clips, I've put the YouTube channel where it's come from and the title of the video. Any and all of these will be or should already be on the playlist, the testimonies, the information and the advice, the magic playlist, which I have now changed so that they are properly accessible, because I didn't realise you had to do the whole collaborate thing. So that I fixed it. So any of these should be available on there, but of course you can just search them up yourself as well. If you want to watch the whole thing, I'm sure it will explain more of what the actual spells are or rituals are that are being done. But again, this is just to give an idea of the different sort of types of traditions. Okay, so Solomonic, as far as I'm aware, in terms of magical texts, grimoires and whatnot. I think these are some of the earliest known. There may be more ancient, sort of going back to Sumerian and Babylonian sort of texts. I'm sure things in, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and that kind of stuff, I'm sure there's mention of or allusion to various forms of magic in those times. But as far as instructive text manuals, grimoires, I think this is kind of the gold standard, if you like. So a bit of history, just in case, because I didn't know the history of King Solomon. If you want to pause and read who he is and what his background was and what he's known for, then a bit of information there. Loads of information available online as well, of course. There's several grimoires connected to Solomonic magic. The greater keys and the lesser keys appear to be the most well-known ones or the most utilized ones. Definitely ties in with religious sort of ceremonial types of magic, not it's not amateur stuff. It's not the kind of stuff that you can be just like a kitchen witch at home practicing with bits of stuff, like utilizing these in their fullest extent. I think that a lot of these rituals and or practices are very, very detailed. So in the session that I did where I talked about my experience being a target, and then part 2 I talked about how did I know who was targeting me, and it gave some sort of segments of evidence that kind of contributed to my knowingness of who I was being targeted by. And I talked in that about some things that were highlighted in a remote view of Kim Gergen. And as we go through these sessions, more will be emphasized about why I'd made the connection with the theosophy and the religious ceremonial magic used in orders such as the Order of the Golden Dawn. So, if you've not seen that previous session, you're probably not going to understand what I'm talking about. But in that session, I lay out a rationale, let's say, that as I'd been gathering information, my attention had been piqued, let's say, by some comments that were made in a video where a handful of different remote viewers had been given Kim Gergen as a target, but obviously remote viewing is done blind, so they didn't know who they were remote viewing on. They just had gone through the motions, utilizing the technique as it's been trained, and they'd all come up with some interesting stuff, and it all did corroborate, but one in particular had really honed in on her being involved in sort of ritual magic, and what he described immediately brought my attention to theosophical teachings, but then how that then tied into the forms of magic such as Solomonic, and when we get to the Thelema, they connect as well, so in both cases. So what I've put on here is, this is, if you Google King Solomon or Solomonic magic, the type of stuff that will come up is this kind of stuff here, so talking about the grimoires and showing you that there's that connection to like religious ceremony and stuff. But then with this, what's shown here and what I'm showing here, where I'm circling the arrow right now, that is a screenshot of a video that was shared by someone involved with UNN on one of the chats. That is Kim's overview of the Anunnaki plan for world domination, that when she first started, you know, presenting herself as the new ground command and guardian and all of that kind of stuff, she presented this document, let's say, that is around 6 feet long, and shows, you know, what the Anunnaki plan for taking over the world was supposed to look like. And I'm going to do another session where I'm going to talk in more detail about that. For anybody that comes to listen to this who hasn't got a clue what I'm talking about, in previous videos I've laid out my grievances, let's say, and prior involvement with a person called Kim Gogan, and a, let's say, alternative media community that has sort of gathered around her, and she's the reason I've ended up doing a whole lot of research into black magic, believe it or not. But without, you know, retreading old ground, I just thought it was interesting to see, you know, this image over here, which is an ancient text/document that shows aspects of the teachings within the Solomonic magic tradition, and what Kim later has utilized to show her credentials as a, you know, the ground commander for planet Earth, taking over all the control systems on behalf of humanity. It, to me, looks like inspiration may have been drawn from the magical treatise of Solomon. So on the playlist, Ivy Corvus, her YouTube channel, there's quite a few of her videos that I've linked, because she is one of those practitioners who would, I think she, you know, if you asked her yourself, she might disagree with this, but I think she would come under that grey area of, she seems to be a very kind, decent human being herself, but I think she does and has experimented with and practiced both baneful magic and, you know, light work, light magic. And I think her perception of the use of magic is, it comes from that place of balance. It's about utilizing what is appropriate to reset the scales if an injustice has been done, you know, fixing it, sort of thing. So I'm sure somewhere within her content, because she has done quite a lot of lengthy Q&As and that sort of stuff, so I'm sure she herself has said whether she believes that to be true, but it's the impression I've got based on content that she's put out. She's definitely talked about the use of baneful practices and talked about her own experience of using them, so I guess there has to be some belief on her part that, you know, there's a time and a place to be using that stuff, right? So this is her talking. It's a very short clip, but she's just kind of outlining what, when we refer to Solomonic magic from her perspective as a practitioner, what that is, what that means.
Reputation of being an excellent exorcist, a sorcerer, a magician, basically someone who could command demons and get them to do his bidding. So Solomonic magic is usually working with angels, demons, and jinn. Solomonic magic itself is woven into so many different esoteric traditions. When we think of ceremonial magic, I think this is the tradition that I personally hear about the most of people wanting to practice Solomonic magic. And I wanted to share some information from this book because this book is my first 5-star book of the year. I am so excited to talk about this book and just talk about, Solomonic magic in general. I am so pleasantly surprised with this book. So for those that don't know, I have a 5-star rating system, and last year, the reason why you haven't seen a lot of book videos from me in 2023 is because a lot of the books that I read were very mediocre, and I just didn't feel like there was anything worth talking about. If I read a mediocre book, I don't really feel like I want to waste my time making a book review on it when it was just okay.
So I let her talk about because it comes from the Books and Tea series, I left that in the clip because for people who are interested in learning more about magic from someone who's actually practiced it, I've found her content very engaging, very user friendly, some of the practitioners that are actually teaching people how to use baneful magic and stuff, I genuinely feel a little bit unnerved by them when I'm listening to them speak. I don't feel that way when I listen to Ivy Corvus. Again, each to their own, that as a source of information, and if you do just want to get the scoop in terms of the fact that she does book reviews and that kind of stuff, it's a useful resource, right? Okay, so that brings us on to Thelema, which does tie into, it utilizes a lot of the Solomonic tradition within it, but Aleister Crowley, as we know, developed his own system, which is Thellamagic, over time. And in that previous session, I made the connection that he had for a time been involved with the Order of the Golden Dawn and had taken some of their rituals and then, developed and evolved them into some of, he had several books that is well known for, some of them sort of mentioned here, and they're very easy to find if you look up. I've circled that sort of symbol there because, interestingly, that shows up on some paperwork that was shared as proof of Kim's background and credentials, which, again, I'm going to do another session and I'll piece more of this together, but I found that kind of interesting that showed up on a Google search in relation to Thellamagic. And this symbol here, as we know, Kim has used this in relation to the financial system, the back side system and the front side system, and where the various bindings were that cut people off from their access to their God-given rights and resources and whatnot, which, again, talked already somewhat about that in the God Source Creator Sovereignty session, the second sort of half of that, from around, I think, about 37 minutes into that, or maybe 37 minutes towards the end of that. I think it's the second half of the session. I talk more about where the organic design for how reality is designed to function, how that ties into how the various control systems on this planet have been designed to invert what are our God-given rights and have us agree to forfeit them, which then disallows us reclaiming from, such as the financial system or the political system or the healthcare system, or any and all systems. Our agreement to forfeit our natural rights under natural law is what allows the custodialship and the infiltration and interference with trusteeship that is rightfully ours. So I'm not going to go into a whole explanation of it here, but I do talk about it in that session, and I did in, I believe, the Kim Stalker, Kim Poster, Kim Scammer video 1, I believe it was. I elaborated, a little bit in that session as well, explaining to people what I'd been recording in the days before, because that was stuff that Kim had then tried to, get out ahead of me sharing that information and utilize it herself, but she does so in a very distorted way. She's not telling people the truth of it, she's telling people a very distorted version of it. So again, I don't want to get off on that track, but all of this ties into what has been the last couple of few years of my life, in terms of unknowingly getting drawn into some pretty nefarious agendas and activities that are set up to trap people who are looking to just try to help the world move forward in a positive way. There's ways that those people are being seen and targeted, which is what I've experienced. So that's where all this kind of comes together. So there is no religion higher than truth. I would agree with that, but truth is source coding. So if you're not aligned with that, you're not speaking truth, would be my argument on that front. Right, so yeah, here is a very short clip. I'm not going to show the whole thing, but this is an example of ritual, ceremonial magic as would be ascribed to Solomonic and or Thellamagic traditions. It is the Order of the Golden Dawn. It's their YouTube channel. They've shared this, for copyright purposes, and there's a limit to how much of someone else's content you can share. It's supposed to be for educational purposes, which this is, but obviously you can't share all of their stuff. So this is just a short clip. One of the things I've come to realize, and we'll see this on the next slide, is this, what's known as high magic. So ceremonial magic can also be referred to as high magic, and it can also be referred to as ritual magic. This is the stuff, going back to that last session that I did, when I emphasized, I honed in on what that remote viewer had said about, following very detailed instructions and it having religious components and philosophical components. And this is precisely the kind of thing it brought to mind for me. So this is a banishing pentagram ritual, but looking at the references as well, he's talked about the Emerald Tablet, and obviously it's part of the Golden Dawn system. Anybody that is familiar with Kim's content, the more you look at this stuff, the more you see so many of the things that she's used in her intel. Let's say so many of the topics, the subjects, the sort of systems, when Kim talks about space junk and AI systems and all this kind of stuff, you will find in these magical traditions the same things being talked about. So I feel like that's just, it's a conversion or distortion that's happened, where Kim has taken stuff she knows about in reality and misrepresented it, or disinformed people using truth but in a very distorted way, if that makes sense. So play this.
I initiates of a section of the mysteries of Egypt, which is called the Rosicrucian Order of Alpha Omega, assist me to close the hall in the grade of Neophyte in the Heart of Temple number 7 in Paris. Honored heroes, I beg you to purify this temple with a leisure banishing ritual of the pentagram.
Preachers and sororers, face with me the actual East.
All right, so if we come to this slide, again, this is just a web page. I just searched up, and this is for a different type of ceremony, but again, it comes from Golden Dawn Lectures. This is the Zelator initiation ritual. It comes from, I believe that is one of Aleister Crowley's books, the Book of the Corpse. Yeah, the Magic Library, yeah. So this initiation ritual that is described on that webpage, it's, you know, you have to scroll, there's several phases to it, let's say. So I've just took screenshots of a couple of parts of it, but you can see how detailed it is in terms of who needs to be there, you know, what they're supposed to be wearing, the layout of the ceremonial space in terms of altar and all of, you know, the symbolism that needs to be there. And as it says in this description, it takes 4 days for each step, each stage of this initiation to be carried out. There's certain specific things, you know, in terms of who needs to sort of, I don't know if ordain is the right word for it, but, you know, lead it or oversee it, or so it's much more detailed, restrictive, you know, by the book. Things have to be done in certain ways at certain times, using certain materials and symbols and all of that kind of stuff, which again, in that remote view, in the detail that came out, the whole wearing masks, you know, attending certain types of ceremony, all of this stuff, to me, this is what that would relate to. So, you know, again, these are conclusions that I've drawn as I've been looking into this stuff. Perhaps anyone who's more familiar with some of those other traditions that I've already showed you, I know that there are some of the spell work that is done in those other traditions. I know that there certainly is this more ritualistic and you know, ceremonial kind of process attached to some aspects of, whether you're talking voodoo or hoodoo, or I'm not suggesting in those traditions everything's just thrown together and we'll see what happens kind of thing, but I think that's where understanding the cultural influences in more native sort of traditions coming together with religious institutions and organisations, you can see how and why that would then blend into this combination of, in some respects, being very detailed, step-by-step, methodical, and then in other respects being stuff that anybody can learn and use at home, or, you know, as if you join a group, if you're part of a coven, like, you know, you can combine efforts or whatever. But that's just an overview of existing traditions and systems. In the next session, we can look at what the actual approaches are in terms of what type of spell work there is, what tools and methods are used, and I've got more clips for more people to describe as a practitioner what they have done, what they've been able to accomplish. And in some of these clips, there's talk about the types of money involved if you are a sought after practitioner. There's incredible demand, let's say, for anyone who's proven that they are good at what they do when it comes to that kind of work. Then there's no short supply of customers. We'll look at that in the next session. Okay, so that's the end of part 1. Thank you for listening. Playlists, as I've already mentioned, are now properly available. I've done the collaborate thing. And for anybody who needs to hear it, you're most powerful when aligned with God, Source, Creator, and the truth. You may not always feel it, and others may try to convince you that you're not, but you are. So that's a bit of an intense ending message, but I do mean it, and I do hope that as and when people come to hear this, if the reason you come across it is because you're searching for more information, because you've experienced being targeted in any kind of way, the last thing I'd want is to introduce all of this to you and you feel like overwhelmed by what you're quote unquote up against. You are more than powerful enough to overcome whatever effects have been created as a result of you not knowing your power and knowing your rise. And as we go through the next couple of sessions, I'll emphasize that more, and hopefully for anybody that's found this because they need it, after the next 2 sessions you'll be feeling much more, bring it on, let's do this, because it took me a few months of having to, sort of go and look this information up and get my head around it. And I did for a time feel disempowered. I did for a time feel I was panicking. I felt stuck. I didn't know how to get out from under the denseness, the heaviness of a lot of the energetic effects that are being created. And, there were some entity attachment type things that it felt like had got a pretty nasty grip at one point, but as I learned and got a grip of this stuff, the more my own sense of not only I can do this, but get ready, this is game on, all right, now I've started learning some of the rules. I know what I can do and I know what I can't or shouldn't do, and I'm cool with that. We are powerful beings. So that's the end of part 1. I will see you very shortly for part 2, or I'll be speaking to you. Anyway, much love, everyone.